Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the key to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast, where you watch, learn and succeed on your way to becoming a PMP. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson, we are going to take a look at collecting requirements from your stakeholders in the collect requirements process. This is an important and early step on your project, because how do you know what your stakeholders want if you don't ask them about it first? The requirements gathered and agreed to set the boundaries or scope of the project, which in turn then determines the work that needs to be done to satisfy the stakeholders. In this lesson, we will discuss the process of collecting project requirements, how to categorize requirements to manage them more effectively, the tools and techniques you can use to collect project requirements, and we'll look at the requirements traceability matrix and the structure and usage of such a requirements traceability matrix. And because collecting requirements is an important process which lays the foundation of your scope, there is a lot to say, and we broke this lesson into two parts. In part 1, you'll see our usual overview, followed by the inputs and the first 5 tools and techniques, and then in part 2, we look at 6 more tools and techniques. Yes, there are in fact 11 of them. We'll see the outputs and we'll do a review. We begin at the very top by starting out with the official definition for project scope management. Project scope management includes the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required to complete the project successfully. And of course, if you add these two together, you end up with your scope. Project scope management, the knowledge area, has 6 processes, and you've probably already seen the first lesson that we have on plan scope management. That's the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. The main output here is the scope management plan. We're now moving on and we're going into sort of the first step of defining our scope, and the output, the scope management plan we have from this process, now moves as an input into the process that we're focusing on in this lesson, collect requirements. The process of determining, documenting and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet project objectives. From here, we move on to define scope. That's the process of developing a detailed description of the project and product. Once we have that detailed description, we are going to create the work breakdown structure in the process of subdividing project deliverables and project work into smaller, more manageable components. Once that is done, we are also going to have to validate the scope. Somebody has to tell us, is this the way we should have done it? Is this correct? Do you, Mr. Customer, accept it? This is the process of formalizing acceptance of the completed project deliverables. And finally, we want to make sure that we only deliver the scope that we agreed to in the beginning. We need to control the scope in the process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. And here is our usual matrix of the processes and process groups and where they fall. And if you remember, here in scope management, we have 4 processes that fall into planning and 2 processes that fall into monitoring and controlling. We're currently looking at collect requirements, and we're still in the planning process group. The main concept you have to understand in this process is that as a project manager, you must know what your stakeholders want in order to deliver to their expectations. So it's necessary for you to understand their needs. And it is done through the collect requirements process that you identify, document and manage business and stakeholder needs for your project. The collect requirements process includes 4 primary steps. Collect the explicit and implicit needs and expectations of the business and all project stakeholders. Organize requirements into different categories to refine and quantify them and to manage and measure them more effectively. Document and provide enough detail so that all requirements are represented in the project scope. And finally, trace the life cycle of each requirement throughout the project life cycle. Many companies organize requirements into different types or categories to refine and quantify them and to manage and measure them more effectively. Organizing requirements into different categories helps also to further define explicit and implicit details to ensure that each is represented in the project scope. Here are some of these categories, beginning with business requirements, which support the organization's business objectives and articulate the rationale for the project from a business perspective. Stakeholder requirements that describe what is important to sponsors, customers, users, and everyone involved in the project. Solution requirements, which describe the features and functionality of the final project deliverable, and these are often further broken down into functional requirements that describe how the final project deliverable will work, and non-functional requirements that describe the factors required for the final project deliverable to perform as expected. We have transition requirements describing the conditions needed to change from the current state to a future state. And these are typically temporary conditions that must be satisfied to achieve the final project deliverable. For example, a company may conduct user training or set up a test lab to validate software functionality. We have project requirements. These address the needs of the project itself and the conditions the project must meet to be successful. And finally, quality requirements, which describe the criteria used to validate all requirements and the final project deliverable. Let's take a brief look together at Figure 5-4 from the PMBOK guide, our usual quick introduction to the ITTOs here. And please do not get overwhelmed. Yes, there are indeed 11 tools and techniques here, but we are going to review them, and by the end of part 2 of this lesson, you will have mastered all of them. So let's start with the inputs. The 5 inputs in this process all come to us from various other processes, which means that each of these 5 items is reviewed in detail in those lessons where they are originally created. So right here, we're only going to do a quick high-level overview. Here they are. It all begins with the scope management plan, which describes how the project scope is defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and verified. It helps the team determine the types of requirements that should be collected, documented, and managed. The requirements management plan describes the method used to define and document stakeholder needs. Then we have the stakeholder management plan. It describes the stakeholder communication requirements and the level of influence and engagement and participation you can expect from each project stakeholder during requirements planning and throughout the project lifecycle. And by the way, do you remember the definition of this process? It's the process of determining, documenting and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet project objectives. So the requirements management plan and the stakeholder management plan, they are used specifically to answer the definition of this process, managing stakeholder needs. Moving on to the project charter, it provides a high-level description of the product, service, or final project result. So it's a high level scope that we already have in there. And finally, the stakeholder register, which is used to identify stakeholders. Again, referring back to the definition of this process, stakeholders who can provide information about the requirements. The stakeholder register also captures the stakeholder requirements and expectations. That's it for our high-level overview of the inputs we need. We're moving on to the tools and techniques, and Collect Requirements has 11 of those to help you collect the requirements from project stakeholders. These include interviews with stakeholders to collect and record information, including confidential information that helps you further define the project and the final project deliverable. Interactive discussions by focus groups involving stakeholders and experts to learn their expectations and viewpoints about the final project deliverables. We have facilitated workshops where important stakeholders assemble to discuss requirements and build stakeholder consensus. Workshops provide opportunities to identify and resolve issues quickly. Then we have several group creativity techniques that can help identify requirements, and these techniques include brainstorming, the nominal group technique, mind mapping, affinity diagrams, and multi-criteria decision analysis. And finally, group decision-making techniques can also help identify, categorize, and prioritize requirements. So we're going to review the various methods used to reach group decisions. We have 6 more tools and techniques to get to, but we'll get to those in part 2. So just briefly, they are going to be questionnaires and surveys, observations, prototypes, benchmarking, context diagrams, and document analysis. But more about those in part 2. And before we get into the details of the first 5 tools and techniques, a quick reminder about this particular project management proverb here. Fits nicely into this lesson. At some point in the project, you're going to have to break down and finally define the requirements. With that said, let's get to it. Interviews are direct conversations with key stakeholders to collect and document information, including confidential information about the project and project requirements. Here are some suggestions for conducting effective interviews with your project stakeholders. First of all, when interviewing many stakeholders, prepare the questions and deliver them to the interviewees in advance of the actual interview. Limit an interview to just 3 or 4 major topics, depending on the length and quality of the answers you receive. Ask 3 or 4 more granular questions about each topic and continue until you feel that you have gathered enough information. But be aware of the interviewee bias, perhaps for a specific product feature that they like or a product function that is particularly important to the stakeholder you're currently interviewing. And most importantly, don't forget to also discuss the business culture and political challenges of this project, of the product, of the general environment that you're working in as you are meeting this particular stakeholder one-on-one. Remember, this is the moment when you can get confidential information from them because you're one-on-one. A focus group, on the other hand, is a form of qualitative research in which a group of people are asked for their thoughts about a certain subject. And during the Collect Requirements process, a representative group of our stakeholders can be used as a focus group to define project requirements. There are a number of ways to set up a focus group, and these include a 2-way focus group. So that is when one focus group observes another focus group and then discusses the interactions and conclusions that they observe from the first group. We have a dual moderator focus group. This is when one moderator monitors and controls the session while another ensures that the participants discuss all of the focus group topics. Or the dueling moderator focus group. Here we have two moderators, and each of them takes an opposing side on an issue that is under discussion here. We have the respondent moderator focus group, where one or more of the respondents acts as a temporary moderator. We have the client participant focus group. This is where one or more customers participate covertly or overtly in the discussion. Then we have the mini focus group, or a subgroup composed of only 4 or 5 members of a larger focus group. And finally, a teleconference or an online focus group. This is, of course, where groups use a voice or video conferencing system over the internet for the focus group meeting, as opposed to a physical meeting altogether in a office. Using focus groups to collect project requirements can have positive and negative consequences. Let's start out with the positive consequences. Focus groups produce good sources of data and various insights that are less attainable without people interactions in a group setting. It's also known as the group effect, where group members engage and experience a chaining or cascading effect of ideas and solutions. Focus groups help define project language. When you have a project of unexplored territory, group members discover a native project language and describe experiences that they have in common. Focus groups also encourage information disclosure and validation among similar people in the project setting. As conversations take place, similar experiences may surface that support the process. On the other side, in the negative consequences area, we have the fact that with focus group comes less control, where the moderator simply has less control over a group than with one-on-one meetings, and time can be lost on irrelevant topics. Data that comes out during the focus group meetings may be difficult to analyze, simply because much of the discussion is in reaction to comments from other team members. Some focus groups require a trained moderator because groups are quite variable and can be tough to get together and keep together. And finally, the size of a focus group may not be large enough to be a good representation, a sample of stakeholders, so that the information you get from this does maybe not include everything that is required for the project. We're moving on to facilitated workshops for stakeholders, which provide a structured forum to discuss and reach agreements about project requirements with inputs from key areas of the business and subject matter expert. During these facilitated workshops, important stakeholders, they assemble to exchange views and build stakeholder consensus about project requirements. Stakeholders who are part of the group decision-making process, they are more likely to commit to the decisions, and they feel a greater sense of ownership for the decisions that they have made. Because stakeholders are active players in the decision-making process, the levels of confidence and understanding of the workshop output are very likely going to be high. If you anticipate disagreements over the project or product requirements and you wish to work through them during early stages of the project, workshops provide opportunities to identify and resolve issues quickly. Stakeholders clarify misunderstandings and build on each other's ideas, gaining momentum and gaining a better understanding of each person's viewpoint. Workshops, they benefit large projects with many stakeholders, so bringing together people from various divisions of a company into a workshop helps these people understand how the different areas of the organization contribute to the business and to the project at hand. And since we now have a group of people together in a room, let's review several group creativity techniques that project teams practice to identify project and product requirements, starting obviously with, yes, Brainstorming is a way to identify and collect ideas about the project and product. Through spontaneous group discussion and contribution, participants speak openly and provide impulsive responses without criticism or judgment from others in the group. The group simply provides ideas that might lead to a solution, and then additional techniques may be used to organize and prioritize the ideas. Teams often use the nominal group technique to brainstorm and then prioritize ideas. Participants here write down their ideas and submit them anonymously to a group facilitator. Then the group votes on each idea. It may take more than one session for teams to identify and prioritize the most important requirements. Next, we have idea or mind mapping. This is a brainstorming method of association where ideas are consolidated into an idea map. Participants may discover that they have a common understanding of the issues as they share information about their ideas. New ideas may arise by association, and these are added to the map as well. Participants prioritize all ideas once captured on these idea or mind maps. Then also we have the affinity diagram, another brainstorming technique that allows teams to organize ideas into categories or groups. Participants write down their ideas and submit them again to a group facilitator who then works with the group to place ideas into categories for further review and analysis. And finally, we have the multi-criteria decision analysis. This is an analytical technique where participants use a decision matrix to evaluate and prioritize ideas using evaluation criteria such as business risk and customer value. And how do we decide which of these many ideas we're going to be using? Well, many companies use various techniques to generate, assess, and prioritize project and product requirements, and they use various ways to reach decisions about them as well. And some of these ways are unanimity. This refers to complete agreement by everybody in the group, so you need 100% consensus. Then we have majority. Majority occurs when over 50% of the participants agree to a decision. We have plurality. This occurs when a large percentage of the group agrees on a decision with or without a majority agreement when considering more than two alternatives. And we also have dictatorship. And of course, dictatorship occurs when one person in a group makes a decision. And that person right now is me, because I'm deciding that we have now come to the end of part 1 of our review in the collect requirements process. So Justine says,
Bonne chance, mes amis.
And it's until next time from me.